expand. And the street wall no longer extends along State Street, but it bends a corner around what is the dog park, but I think it's much more than a dog park. It's a beautiful triangle. And what that triangle does is it begins to set up that street wall. The street wall turns the corner and then becomes one of the more historic buildings on the property. But what happens is, as you pass the bend, all of a sudden, the definition that is so clear along State Street begins to dissolve, and there isn't a place here, and that's why no one is ever there, as you might notice from the way you live here. And you can see the street wall that you know so well. It's defined by shops, it's defined by buildings, it's defined by trees, a sidewalk, a real active environment. And as you extend up State Street further, you can see that that environment sort of says that it keeps going. And in fact, it really wants to bend around the corner, but actually it really doesn't bend around the corner. It stops abruptly at this building and the triangular park. There are some wonderful aspects to the site, and this building is of great value. I think visually, historically, it sets a place. I think it would be missing if we didn't have that building here, because as I said, it takes that street wall along State Street, it opens up State Street, it begins to turn the corner, and then it drops off at this point. So you can show if you can move forward. And you can see what happens is all of a sudden the character of the buildings turn, the shape of the buildings turn. There are spaces, the trees are no longer as large. There's nobody walking the streets, of course, because there's no there at the end of this street. So one of our goals is to begin to see if we can invigorate this portion of the street and continue the context that is along State Street that we see further down. Just going back to this diagram, so you can see that this is the portion of State Street that really begins to fall apart from a city planning perspective. So looking at the site in a little more detail, you can see the site is outlined here. And one of our goals is to, in fact, take the very rich retail environment that exists along State Street, bring it into this building so we can activate this building, and then bring that retail all the way down around the corner. So in fact, it continues that street wall environment that I think is really so valuable. We're thinking to ourselves that this portion of the site is the part of the site that we'd like to maintain as is, same heights, same configuration, same facade, and that most of the building stock and the rest of that portion of the site is not nearly as valuable as this portion of the site is. So we're thinking about activating this from a retail perspective, the second floor being more commercial space, so that it might be small office spaces available to the neighborhood, as well as the introduction of restaurants and continuing the shop character that exists on State Street. We would take that character, bend it around the corner in this existing building so that we have this portion of the building would continue to be retail, this portion of the building would continue to be commercial space, and from here on we would begin to introduce housing. Now, one of the interesting things is we were thinking to ourselves, well, what kind of entrance might we have to the site? State Street clearly is a vehicular street. Of course, Mechanic Street has vehicles on that, but we thought to ourselves that the site is really addressing two different characteristics of the neighborhood. One is a much more pedestrian neighborhood where there are many more people cycling and bicycling and walking, and we thought the best place to introduce cars or automobiles to the site was in fact on State Street, so we would keep all of the vehicular access from this site off of the smaller streets, but we would maintain it on the streets that can in fact contain and handle a greater vehicular population. We also were very much concerned about the scale and character of the the neighborhood. We're thinking about the building materials that occur in the neighborhood, and there's a very interesting vocabulary that exists throughout the area where many houses are split with two doors, so they essentially have two entrances, one for the upper units and one for the lower unit. And that's a vocabulary that's quite consistent in the area. So we thought we would begin to use that as a reference point as we started our design work. Again, this is just across Mechanic Street. And Mechanic Street is very much a neighborhood street. It's the place where you sit on the porch. It's where you chase the kids that you're really not interested in having play in front of the house or whether they're doing something wrong. It's a place where the residents interact with the street. And that's a very important aspect of the neighborhood. And so one of the things we wanted to do is on Mechanic Street, we wanted to encourage that, in fact, reinforce that activity. So that became part of our thinking. And then as we thought about, well, what are the natural materials that we see in the neighborhood? And we do see a lot of clapboard, shingle-style buildings that are throughout the neighborhood. And of course, there's a wide variety of brick buildings. I'm sure you're familiar with this brick. But then an important building for me is a building that, in fact, as you know, really combines two materials. It has a strong, hard base, which is brick, a common material in the area, but yet it lightens the character of the building as the building gets higher. And in fact, it begins to reduce the scale of the building. Even though this is a three-story building, the building scale is reduced significantly because part of the building is housed behind the roof. And that's a trick architects have been using for centuries, where they can begin to reduce the height and scale of a building by hiding some of the aspects of the building in roof lines. So that was our thinking. As we began to develop the site, again, we were thinking about vehicular entry here, we were thinking about pedestrian, exclusively pedestrian entry from this side, and introducing mews so that there is an area in which it's only valuable to pedestrians and in fact encourages walking. Part of our model here was what we refer to as the garden suburb. And the architects out there probably know what a garden suburb is. There are a number of planned communities, relatively large scale communities, that really began to introduce the garden into the urban environment. And in fact created some very significant urban environment. So with that thinking behind us, we began to model this site. And as we looked at it, we thought to ourselves, well, on Mechanic Street, we should introduce housing similar to the other houses that you saw on Mechanic Street. So we're thinking about 2- or 3-story high buildings here with porches, with front doors that look out to Mechanic Streets, interact with Mechanic Street, as well as interacting with the pedestrian mews, which is the major pedestrian entrance to the site, and actually begin to frame views for some of the landscaping treatment we're anticipating. What we already have is we have, at this point, a 1-story building which we would like to expand to a 2-story building, which would then be a series of townhouses, 2-story townhouses, again interacting with the street. And then as we continue around, we're hoping to create commercial area all along here at the ground and second floor. The second floor would be small office space. The ground floor we're anticipating would be retail space, as I said, shops. And this environment is a very different environment than the Mechanic Street environment. This is very much a residential neighborhood. This is very much a commercial zone. So what we're doing is we're creating the site and developing the site in a way that the site uses actually react specifically to the environment on the outside that already exists. Then, challenge architects always have today is parking. How to handle parking in the most unobtrusive manner as possible and still provide adequate parking for the residents. And is there a correct rule of thumb as to how much parking you should provide